Karen didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She barged straight into my cabin like she owned the place, waving HOA papers in my face and screaming that I had 24 hours to leave. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that sitting at my kitchen table was a U.S. district judge, the very man I had just been briefing about her HOA's illegal activities. The look on her face when she realized she wasn't just harassing me but interrupting federal business? That was the moment the ground began to crack under her feet. But before I tell you what happened inside that cabin, let me take you back to how this war really began. My name is Stephen Kelly. I'm 48 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and for the last 10 years this lake cabin has been the only place where I can breathe. I bought it after my father passed, not just as a retreat but as a promise to myself that I would keep alive the memories we built fishing, chopping wood, and watching the sunsets across Maple Lake. Out here, life was simple. The cabin was modest, weather-beaten in places, but it stood as strong as the values my old man raised me with. And for years nobody questioned my right to be here, until Karen Whitfield showed up. She moved in just over 3 years ago, a former real estate agent from the city with a smile that never reached her eyes. Within months, she had wormed her way into becoming the HOA president, and suddenly rules nobody had cared about for decades started appearing in mailboxes like clockwork. The kind of rules that told you what color your shed had to be painted, how short your grass must be cut, even what you could park in your driveway. At first, I laughed it off. I figured if I ignored her, she'd eventually lose interest. But Karen didn't lose interest. She doubled down. Letters turned into fines. Fines turned into threats. And soon her board was practically camped on my lawn, pointing at my boat, my woodpile, even the flag I flew from my porch. They called me non-compliant, disruptive, a stain on their so-called community standards. To me, it was harassment. But what Karen didn't know, what she still doesn't realize, is that every move she made only pushed me closer to uncovering something that would change this fight forever. It started on a Saturday morning in early spring. I was on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the fog lift off Maple Lake, when I heard the sound of heels clacking down my gravel driveway. Nobody wore heels out here. And sure enough, there was Karen, HOA binder clutched under her arm like it was a holy book. 2 board members trailing behind her with clipboards. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Stephen," she snapped, "we've had multiple complaints. Your cabin is in violation of 7 separate HOA ordinances." She flipped her binder open like she was about to read me my last rites. I leaned against the porch rail, calm as I could be, and asked, "Complaints from who? The trees?" That got a chuckle from one of the board members. But Karen's glare could have curdled milk. She launched into a tirade about my unapproved wood storage, the unsightly boat, and most offensively to her, the flagpole I'd installed without written permission. I told her the cabin had stood here long before her bylaws, and it would stand long after. That's when she leaned closer, her voice dropping. "If you don't comply, Stephen, I'll make sure you're removed. I don't care what it takes." Something in her tone told me she wasn't bluffing. It wasn't just about fines anymore. This was personal. She turned on her heel, binder snapping shut, and marched back down the drive with her little entourage. I watched them go, the hairs on my arms prickling, because I could feel it. This wasn't the end of her crusade. It was the beginning. And deep down, I knew she was about to make a move that would change everything. The next time I saw Karen, she didn't come alone. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled up my drive one afternoon, dust swirling behind it, and there she was, standing tall beside the deputy like she'd just brought backup to a duel. The deputy walked over politely enough, hat in hand, and said, "Mr. Kelly, we've had reports of non-compliance with HOA codes." Behind him, Karen's smirk said it all. She thought she finally had me cornered. I invited the deputy up to the porch, showed him my paperwork, original purchase deed, tax receipts, and proof I wasn't under HOA jurisdiction when I bought the place. He frowned, flipping through the documents, clearly seeing I wasn't the pushover Karen had painted me to be. "Looks like a civil matter, ma'am," he said, handing the papers back. Karen's face turned red, her voice rising. He's lying. That cabin is under OA control. It's in the covenants. The deputy gave her a tired look. Then you'll need to take it to court. And with that, he left. Karen, though? She lingered at the bottom of my steps, glaring up at me. Enjoy your little victory, she hissed, because next time I'll make sure you're out of here for good. Then she stormed off. I stood there, papers still in my hand, and I knew, if she was willing, to drag the sheriff out here, the next step was going to be bigger, much bigger. It didn't take long for Karen to crank things up. A week later, I pulled into the local community center parking lot, thinking I was just going to grab a coffee, and head home when I saw the flyer taped to the door, emergency HOA meeting, property compliance vote. My cabin was printed right there on the paper, circled in red like a wanted poster. Inside, the place was packed. Neighbors who barely knew my name were crammed into folding chairs, whispering, as Karen stood at the front with her binder propped on a podium. Stephen Kelly, she announced, has ignored repeated violations. His cabin is a danger to our community's values. Tonight, we vote to authorize legal removal. I walked in mid-sentence, and the room went dead quiet. All eyes turned to me. Karen froze for a second, but quickly regained her footing. Perfect timing, she sneered. Would you like to explain why you think you're above the rules everyone else follows? I didn't flinch. I told them plain and simple. My cabin was never under HOA jurisdiction. When I bought it, and I had the original deeds to prove it, I held the papers high, letting everyone see the official stamps. Karen laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Old paperwork doesn't change the law, Stephen. Times have changed. But I noticed something then. Not everyone was nodding along with her. A few neighbors leaned forward, curious, maybe even doubtful. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me versus Karen anymore. She was trying to turn the entire community against me. And unless I found a way to reveal the truth she feared most, she might just succeed. 2 days after that so-called emergency meeting, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox. Inside were legal papers. Karen had hired an HOA attorney and was officially filing for a court injunction to have me removed from the property. I'll admit, for a split second my stomach dropped. Legal threats are designed to scare you, and Karen was banking on me folding under the pressure. But as I read through the stack, line by line, I realized something. Her lawyer had cited the wrong land plat. They were trying to apply rules from a subdivision that hadn't even existed when my father first bought the cabin. It was sloppy, desperate, and worse for her, completely illegal. That's when I made a phone call, not to a lawyer of my own, but to an old colleague, Judge Harold Denning, a U.S. district judge who'd once worked on zoning disputes with me years ago. He wasn't just a colleague, he was a friend who respected the truth. And he knew the ins and outs of property law better than anyone. When I explained what was happening, he didn't hesitate. Stephen, he said, I want to see those documents myself. This sounds like more than just HOA overreach. It sounds like fraud. That one word, fraud, changed everything. Karen thought she was tightening the noose, but what she had really done was open the door to a federal investigation. When Judge Denning agreed to meet me at my cabin to review the files, I knew the balance of power was about to shift. The only thing I didn't know was how explosive it would get when Karen realized exactly who was sitting at my kitchen table. The following Friday evening, Maple Lake was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound carry. I'd laid out every document I had on the kitchen table: deeds, tax, records, survey maps, waiting for Judge Harold Denning to arrive. When his black sedan pulled up the gravel drive, I felt both relief and tension coil in my chest. He was a man in his early 60s, tall, sharp-eyed, the kind of presence that made a room fall silent without him ever raising his voice. As he stepped inside, I offered coffee, and he waved it off with a smile. Let's get right to business, Stephen, he said, adjusting his glasses as he spread the papers across the table. For the next hour, we went line by line. He pointed out errors in Karen's claims, inconsistencies in the plats, even a forged signature on one of the filings. This isn't just aggressive, he said grimly. This borders on criminal. Hearing that sent a cold chill through me. Outside, the lake wind rattled the old shutters, and in that moment I thought about my father, about the promise I'd made to protect this place. That's when the sound of footsteps crunched outside on the gravel. Loud, fast, uninvited. Then, the front door swung open with a slam. Karen stormed in, binder clutched under her arm, flanked by two HOA board members like stormtroopers. She didn't even notice who was at the table. "Stephen Kelly," she barked, "this ends tonight. You will sign this compliance order, or we will have you dragged out by morning." But then she froze, eyes narrowing at the man sitting across from me. The judge didn't move, didn't even blink. He just looked up slowly, his gaze locking onto hers. And in that silence you could almost hear the ground shift beneath her feet. For a split second, Karen's bravado held. She slammed her binder onto the table, papers spilling across the wood. "These are official documents," she snapped, "and you will comply, Stephen, tonight." But Judge Denning simply leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said in that steady, low voice of his, "And who exactly do you think you're addressing, Miss Whitfield?" Karen blinked, clearly thrown off by his calm tone. I'm the HOA president," she stammered, "and this property is under our authority." "Who are you?" The judge slid one of her so-called legal notices back across the table toward her, tapping his finger on the forged signature. "I'm the federal judge who will decide whether you're guilty of fraud, harassment, and obstruction of property rights." The color drained from her face so fast you'd think the blood had been vacuumed out. Her board members shifted uncomfortably behind her, exchanging nervous glances. Karen tried to laugh it off, a high, brittle sound. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice cracked. "You can't just waltz into private community matters. You waltzed into a federal review," the judge cut in, his tone like steel. "And now, you've interrupted it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Karen's smirk was gone, her hands trembling as she fumbled to gather her papers. But it was too late. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Karen's mask cracked, but if there's one thing I've learned about her, it's that she doesn't go down easy. Fear flickered across her face, yes, but almost instantly it hardened into that familiar defiance. She straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and snapped, "This is a setup. You two are colluding against the community. I'll have this entire cabin condemned by sunrise if I have to." Her voice was shaky, but her words were sharp. The judge didn't flinch. He calmly slid the forged plat map across the table and said, "Ms. Whitfield, you've just admitted intent to commit fraud in front of a federal officer. I would suggest choosing your next words carefully." The board members behind her shifted nervously, clearly realizing they had hitched their wagon to the wrong horse. But Karen doubled down. She pulled out her phone and barked into it, "This is an emergency. Send the sheriff, now!" The cabin air grew thick with tension as she paced like a trapped animal, glaring at us both. "You can't scare me," she hissed. "You think some old paperwork changes the fact that I control this neighborhood? I'll bury you in lawsuits until you choke on them." Her words echoed, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she clutched that binder like a shield. The judge leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper but sharper than a blade. "Karen, you're not in control anymore. You've just handed me everything I need to end this." For the first time she faltered. Her phone slipped slightly in her grip, and for once she had no quick comeback. And that silence? It was louder than any threat she had ever made. It didn't take long before headlights swept across the cabin windows, cutting through the dark. Gravel crunched, and the sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop out front. Karen straightened instantly, her smirk returning like a mask sliding back into place. "Perfect timing," she said, rushing to the door. "Officer, arrest him. He's trespassing, violating HOA law, and colluding with this so-called judge." The deputy stepped inside, his eyes narrowing at the scene. But before Karen could spin her story, Judge Denning rose to his full height. His voice was calm but carried the kind of authority that made the air stand still. "Deputy," he said, "I am Judge Harold Denning, U.S. District Court. I am here conducting a review of fraudulent property claims presented by this woman and her associates. I suggest you take a seat." The deputy froze, blinking between Karen and the judge, then slowly tipped his hat. "Yes, sir." Karen's jaw fell open. He can't," she sputtered, looking around the room for backup. Her board members were already edging toward the door, pale as ghosts. The deputy looked at her with something close to pity. "Ma'am, I think you'd better sit down and listen." That single line deflated her like a punctured balloon. She backed toward the wall, her binder slipping from her arms, papers scattering across the floor. For the first time since this war began, Karen wasn't the one giving orders. She was cornered, her empire crumbling right there on my cabin floor. And watching her sink into that chair, I realized the fight wasn't over yet. But the battlefield had just shifted entirely in my favor. The room was so tense you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Karen sat hunched in the chair, gripping her binder like a lifeline, her eyes darting between the judge, the sheriff, and me. She thought she still had some cards left to play, but that's when Judge Denning pulled out a separate folder from his briefcase, one she hadn't seen before. He laid it flat on the table, slid it toward her, and said, "Do you know what this is, Miss Whitfield?" She didn't answer, just stared at it, her lips pressed tight. He flipped it open, revealing a stack of documents with her name plastered all over them. Bank statements forged, filings, and even correspondence showing she had siphoned HOA funds into her personal accounts for years. My jaw tightened as I saw the numbers. Tens of thousands of dollars stolen under the noses of her neighbors. Karen's face turned ashen. Where did you get that?" she stammered. The judge didn't blink. "Federal audit requests. Your attorney's sloppy filings flagged more than just Stephen's cabin. They flagged you." The sheriff leaned over the table, whistling low as he skimmed the pages. "Looks like embezzlement to me." Karen's voice cracked as she tried to protest. "No, this is taken out of context." But her words had no weight anymore. The room knew I knew, and worst of all, she knew. The HOA queen who strutted around the community like she owned it all had just been unmasked as a fraud, a thief, and a liar. I'll never forget the look in her eyes as she realized the entire empire she'd built was about to collapse in a courtroom. For the first time, Karen Whitfield didn't look powerful. She looked terrified. The sheriff gathered the papers, tucking them neatly under his arm as if he already knew where this was headed. "Ms. Whitfield," he said evenly, "I'll be turning this over to the county prosecutor first thing in the morning. You'll want to contact an attorney." Karen's face was ghostly pale, her confidence completely shattered. For once, she had no insults, no threats, no clever spin. She just sat there in silence, clutching that empty binder as though it could still protect her. Her board members, the same ones who had cheered her on, quietly slipped out the door, unwilling to share in her downfall. The judge closed his briefcase with a heavy click. "Stephen," he said, giving me a nod, "I believe your property rights are more than secure. And as for Ms. Whitfield, she'll be answering questions in a far bigger court than this cabin." When he left, the air in the room finally felt lighter. I stood by the window, looking out over Maple Lake, the same waters my father had loved. The same cabin that had felt more like a fortress than a home these past months. For the first time in years, I felt peace. This wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about honoring my family's legacy, standing firm against those who believed power gave them the right to trample others. As Karen stumbled out into the night, her once perfect posture now slumped, I knew her reign of intimidation was over. But more than that, I realized something else. Bullies like her thrive only as long as people stay silent. The moment someone stands, the whole empire crumbles. And that night, watching the ripples on the lake, I knew my father would have been proud. So tell me, what would you have done if your HOA tried to steal your home, your land, your family's legacy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've got a story of your own, I'd love to hear it. And don't forget, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around, because the next story, let's just say Karen's kind of trouble is only the beginning.